Charade/Clermont-Ferrand. If Valencia was abandoned for being too dull, Charade or Clermont-Ferrand was abandoned for being the exact opposite. Too dangerous, too wild, too alive. Tucked away in central France, Charade was nicknamed the French Nordschleife, and for good reason. It was a mountain road circuit that wrapped itself around the base of an extinct volcano, the Puy de Dôme. Imagine narrow public roads, blind crests, plunging downhill sections, and endless elevation changes. It was 8 kilometers of madness, part racetrack, part rally stage, part roller coaster. From 1965 to 1972, Charade hosted the French Grand Prix 4 times. Jim Clark conquered it, Jackie Stewart fought it, and admitted it terrified him. The track demanded absolute precision, and one mistake could mean disaster. There were no real runoff zones, just trees, walls, and steep drops. But the danger didn't end there. The volcanic terrain meant rocks would fall onto the racing line during events. Drivers would often finish races with cracked visors, battered helmets, and bruises from flying debris. Stewart once compared it to being hit with stones, fired from catapults, while driving at 150 miles per hour. And yet, despite the chaos, drivers loved the thrill. The corners twisted and turned in a way that challenged car control like few circuits could. Fans called it beautiful but deadly. Charade became known for creating races where skill mattered as much as bravery. But by the early 70s, Formula One was changing. Safety standards were tightening after horrific crashes elsewhere, and circuits like Paul Ricard offered modern facilities with proper runoff areas. Charade simply couldn't keep up. Its danger wasn't romantic anymore. It was unacceptable. The final F1 race at Charade in 1972 ended with the writing on the wall. After years of near misses and countless rock-related injuries, the sport quietly moved on. Charade faded from the calendar, replaced by safer alternatives. Today, parts of the original circuit are still there, winding through the countryside, occasionally used for historic racing. The volcano still looms over it, a silent witness to the madness that once unfolded on its slopes. Charade is remembered not as a failure, but as a legend that burned too bright. If Valencia was Formula One at its most boring, Charade was Formula One at its most terrifyingly beautiful. One was abandoned because nobody cared. The other was abandoned because everyone cared too much to let it kill again. Ramsgeur. In the rolling Champagne region of France lies one of Formula One's most haunting ghosts, Ramsgeur. For decades, it stood as a cathedral of speed, built on public highways with ultra-long straights. It was designed for one thing: top-end velocity. Cars would roar down the seemingly endless stretches, slipstreaming each other in battles where courage outweighed cornering. The first French Grand Prix at Reims came in 1938, and the circuit quickly became known as one of the fastest in the world. It was here, in 1953, that Mike Hawthorne and Juan Manuel Fangio staged one of the most legendary duels in F1 history. Lap after lap, they traded places, using the straights like drag strips. Hawthorne ultimately won by less than a second after nearly 3 hours of racing, the very definition of a slipstream battle. For a time, Reims was the purest expression of Formula One's early obsession with speed. But speed is merciless. The straights were unforgiving. Corners were fast, but lacked any protection. Crashes at Reims were brutal, often deadly. In 1960, Chris Bristow was killed in a horrifying accident, and Alan Stacey died in the same race after being struck by a bird at over 120 miles per hour. These tragedies cemented Reims's reputation as both spectacular and savage. By the 1960s, Formula One was moving towards circuits with modern facilities and better safety. Paul Ricard was built in the south of France, offering wide runoffs and updated infrastructure. Reims, by contrast, had almost none. The French Grand Prix alternated between circuits for a few years, but Reims' fate was sealed. Its final F1 race came in 1966, won by Jack Brabham. By 1972, racing ceased entirely, and yet Reims never disappeared completely. Unlike other abandoned tracks swallowed by redevelopment, parts of it remain eerily intact. The pit buildings, grandstands, and timing tower stand frozen in time, covered in faded advertisements for Elf, Dunlop, and Martini. They sit like a museum without walls, crumbling under the weather but still whispering echoes of the past. Tourists and fans still visit, walking the old start-finish straight, imagining the scream of V12s tearing through the French countryside. Reims is both beautiful and haunting, a monument to an era when bravery mattered more than safety, when speed came first, and when the price of glory was sometimes life itself. Avis. If Reims was about speed through the countryside, Avius was about speed through brutality. Located in Berlin, AVUS wasn't a conventional racing circuit at all. It was essentially two dead-straight Autobahn sections linked by hairpins, with one of them featuring a banking so steep it looked vertical. That banking became infamous. At 43 degrees, it was steeper than anything at Daytona or Indianapolis. Drivers who raced on it described the terrifying sensation of being pinned against the banking at 180 miles per hour, with a constant fear that one slip would send them flying over the top. Spectators, too, often stood dangerously close to the action, watching cars hammer down the straights like missiles. Avis wasn't a regular stop for Formula One, but it did host a world championship race in 1959. That event exposed both the spectacle and the horror of the track. The speeds were insane. Cars hit top gear within seconds, blasting past grandstands packed with Berliners desperate for post-war excitement. But the racing itself was awkward. Overtaking was predictable, and the danger was overwhelming. In fact, danger defined Avis. In earlier eras of racing, countless drivers lost their lives there. The lack of barriers, the proximity of trees and poles, and the sheer velocity made it one of the deadliest circuits in Europe. By the late 1960s, Formula One had no interest in returning. The world was changing, safety campaigns were growing louder, and AVUS was simply incompatible with a modern motorsport. Still, the track lived on for touring cars and German championships into the 1990s. By then, the banking had become a relic, a crumbling piece of concrete too dangerous to use. It was finally demolished in 1999. Today, Avis exists only as part of Berlin's highway system, with no trace of its monstrous curves. Yet in the history of motorsport, Avis stands as a symbol of excess, a place where humans tried to tame speed with concrete walls and nearly paid the price every time. To call it a racetrack feels misleading. It was more like a speed experiment that accidentally became a Grand Prix. For those who raced there, it was unforgettable. For modern fans, it's almost unimaginable. Crystal Palace. When people talk about Formula One in Britain, they think of Silverstone, maybe Brands Hatch. Some old-school fans will mention Donington, but few remember that London itself once hosted Formula One cars. At Crystal Palace Park, the circuit was unique, even by the standards of the 1960s. Built inside a public park in South London, it wasn't a glamorous city street race like Monaco or Singapore. It was narrow, tree-lined, with blind bends, and barely any room for error. Average lap speeds in the 60s reached nearly 100 miles per hour, on roads that were barely wider than modern pit lanes. It looked more like a go-kart track blown up to scale, but drivers loved the challenge. The Palace first hosted races in the 1930s, and after World War II, it became a breeding ground for British racing talent. Formula One cars did race here, but only in non-championship events, the kind that didn't count toward the world title, though they still drew huge crowds. Jackie Stewart and James Hunt both competed here in their early careers. For spectators, it was electric. You could stand just a few feet away from the cars, no fences, no barriers, hearing raw V8s scream through a park better known for family picnics and cricket matches. But that intimacy came at a cost. Safety was non-existent. Cars brushed against trees if they made even the smallest mistake. The straights ended in blind corners, where a single spin could block the road completely. And then there was the noise. Residents in South London complained constantly about the deafening roar of engines, echoing through what was supposed to be a quiet neighborhood park. By the late 1960s, the writing was on the wall. Formula One was already moving toward larger, safer, more commercial circuits. The final major single-seater event at Crystal Palace came in 1970, when Jackie Stewart took part in a Formula 2 race there. By then, the complaints had piled up. The risks were too great, and the economics didn't make sense. London's Grand Prix dream quietly died. Today, if you walk through Crystal Palace Park, you can still trace the outline of the old circuit. A few corners remain, hidden among the trees. Joggers and cyclists ride over the same ground where F1 legends once fought for glory. For younger fans, it sounds like a myth that London once had its own F1 race in a park in front of crowds pressed up against the action. But for those who saw it, Crystal Palace is a reminder of a wilder, more dangerous, and more personal era of motorsport. Sochi Autodrome. Unlike Reims or Avis, Sochi isn't a relic of a forgotten era. It was supposed supposed to be modern, sleek, and permanent. Built around the 2014 Winter Olympics Park, the Sochi Autodrome was Vladimir Putin's pet project to put Russia on the Formula One map. The track debuted the same year as the Olympics, with drivers navigating past arenas, fountains, and wide boulevards. The layout itself wasn't universally loved. Critics mocked the endless 90-degree corners and long straights, comparing it to a street circuit without the character. But despite its flaws, Sochi had its moments. In 2015, Lewis Hamilton clinched his second consecutive championship there. In 2021, Lando Norris famously lost his chance at victory when he stayed out on slicks in sudden rain, handing the win to Hamilton. And for years, Sochi was known as Bottas territory, with Valtteri Bottas earning multiple victories there, proving his mastery on front-limited circuits. But the problem with Sochi wasn't just racing, it was politics. From the start, the race was tied to Putin's image. The Russian president was often present, handing out trophies, using Formula One as a propaganda tool to showcase Russia as a global power. Many fans and journalists disliked the optics, but the contract kept the race alive. Everything changed in 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Formula One cut ties immediately. The Grand Prix was canceled, the long-term contract terminated, and while the circuit still exists for local racing, its Formula One future was erased overnight. Unlike Valencia or Hanoi, this wasn't about money or logistics. It was about geopolitics. A race had been erased, not because of dull racing or dangerous corners, but because of war. Today, Sochi still functions as a smaller circuit for local motorsport, but its days on the international stage are finished. It stands as the most modern abandoned Formula One track, a reminder that sometimes the fate of a race has nothing to do with cars or fans and everything to do with the world outside the circuit. For Formula One, Sochi's end was symbolic. The sport often tries to stay neutral, chasing money wherever it flows. But when the outside world forces its hand, even Formula One must abandon its playgrounds. Dallas Fair Park. In the early 1980s, Formula One was desperate to crack the American market. The United States was a golden prize for Bernie Ecclestone. Big money, big sponsors, and a massive potential audience. But one attempt stands above the rest for its sheer disaster. The Dallas Grand Prix of 1984. The plan looked good on paper. Dallas officials wanted to showcase the city to the world, so they built a temporary circuit in Fair Park, right in the heart of downtown. It was meant to be flashy, exciting, and profitable. Instead, it became a weekend of chaos that fans and drivers still talk about with disbelief. The biggest mistake? Scheduling it in July, in Texas. In the middle of a heatwave, track temperatures reached nearly 60 degrees Celsius. The asphalt literally started to melt under the cars. Mechanics touched the ground and burned their hands. Drivers fainted from exhaustion before even climbing into their cockpits. Nigel Mansell famously collapsed while trying to push his stricken Lotus over the finish line, fainting in front of the cameras. And that wasn't the only disaster. The track itself was falling apart. Construction had been rushed, and the surface broke apart after just a few practice sessions. Cars bounced over potholes, suspension pieces shattered, and tires blistered instantly. The paddock had no shade, the facilities were poor, and while crowds showed up in big numbers, they were met with chaos instead of a proper Grand Prix. Of the 26 drivers who started, only 8 made it to the finish. The winner was Keke Rosberg, father of future world champion Nico Rosberg, who thrived in the chaos. But the race was a humiliation for Formula One. Drivers threatened to boycott. Bernie Ecclestone himself admitted it was unsustainable. The Dallas GP never returned. In the aftermath, Formula One abandoned Fair Park and eventually shifted to other U.S. venues like Phoenix and later Austin. Dallas was buried in history as one of the worst organized F1 races ever. Today, when fans debate the worst circuits of all time, Dallas almost always makes the list. Not because it was boring, because it was dangerous, brutal, and poorly thought out from start to finish. It was Formula One's American dream turned nightmare, and it remains the ultimate example of how not to bring the sport to new markets. Valencia Street Circuit. When Fernando Alonso became a 2-time world champion in 2005 and 2006, Spain erupted into F1 fever. Until then, Formula One had been a niche sport in the country, but Alonso's meteoric rise transformed him into a national hero. Politicians and businessmen saw dollar signs, or rather euros, in the hysteria. Spain already had the long-standing Circuit de Barcelona-Catalunya hosting the Spanish Grand Prix, but officials on the east coast of Spain wanted their own jewel, a glamorous counterpart to Monaco that would showcase Valencia to the world. So, they commissioned a street circuit along the city's harbor, with gleaming yachts as the backdrop. They hired Herman Herman Tilke, the architect of Shanghai, Bahrain, and Istanbul Park, expecting another masterpiece. On paper, it was perfect. A mix of waterfront glamour, a city vibe, and a global superstar, Alonso, to bring in fans. When the Valencia street circuit debuted in 2008, hopes were sky high. But the problem with racing is that spectacle can't be faked. The harbor looked pretty. The yachts were lined up. Yet once the cars hit the track, reality set in. The layout was flat, narrow in the wrong places, wide in others, with little rhythm. Corners blended into each other without flow, and overtaking became virtually impossible. By 2009, the farce was complete. Overtaking was almost non-existent, with only a handful of passes across the entire race. Fans called it Monaco without the charm, a poor imitation that lacked the glamour, history, and technical challenge of the real thing. There were moments, chaotic ones, not heroic. In 2010, Mark Webber's Red Bull launched off the back of Heikki Kovalainen's Lotus, flying into the air before smashing nose first into the barriers. That image of Webber somersaulting was the only time Valencia truly shocked the world, but for all the wrong reasons. For 5 years, Valencia limped along, alternating between dull parades and accidents, with Alonso occasionally giving the locals something to cheer for. His 2012 victory in front of Spanish fans remains one of his most emotional, but it was a rare flicker in an otherwise lifeless venue. Behind the scenes, the financial story was uglier than the on-track one. The event had been sold as part of a rotation deal with Barcelona, where the Spanish Grand Prix would alternate between the two circuits from 2013 onwards. But corruption scandals, poor planning, and financial collapse meant the deal fell apart. Valencia's organizers went bankrupt, unable to sustain the massive hosting fees that Formula One demanded. By the time the dust settled, the streets were abandoned, the barriers dismantled, and the dream of Spain having its own Monaco left to rot. Today, the remnants of the Valencia street circuit still exist. Some of the roads are public, open to everyday traffic. The harbor still sits there, eerily familiar to fans who remember its brief run. But for motorsport history, Valencia became the perfect example of hubris. A track built on hype, politics, and money, without the racing soul to back it up. It died not because of tragedy, not because of safety, but because it was forgettable. And in Formula One, being forgettable is the harshest death of all. Vietnam GP few Formula One venues are as bizarre as Hanoi, not because of its layout. It was actually a clever mix of long straights and complex corners, but because it became the first major F1 track abandoned before a single race ever took place. The plan was ambitious. Announced in 2018, the Vietnam Grand Prix was supposed to be Formula One's next big Asian market. Hanoi's government threw its weight behind it, with a design partly inspired by Suzuka and Monaco. Herman Tilke, F1's go-to architect, combined a permanent section with public roads, creating a hybrid that looked fast, technical, and promising. The 2020 calendar even included it as one of the early races in April. Then, the world changed. COVID-19 shut down everything. The debut was delayed, then postponed again. But while other canceled races eventually returned, Australia, Japan, Singapore, Hanoi didn't. The reason was corruption. The key Vietnamese politician who had secured the race was arrested in a bribery scandal unrelated to F1. And suddenly, there was no political will to fund the Grand Prix. The entire project collapsed overnight. The track, though, still exists. Built roads, infrastructure, and grandstands stand like a ghost city on Hanoi's outskirts. In the F1 video game, fans could race around it virtually, imagining what might have been. And many noted, it actually felt good to drive. The massive straight would have produced high-speed battles. The tight midsection corners tested precision. The final sweeps looked fast and brutal. It might have been a surprise hit on the calendar, but we'll never know. Instead, Hanoi joined motorsport's graveyard before ever taking a green flag. Today, parts of the circuit are used for local motorsport events, but the dream of a Vietnam Grand Prix is dead. For F1, it became a cautionary tale. You can spend millions, build a circuit, and hype up a nation, but if the politics and money collapse, it doesn't matter. Hanoi remains a track that exists only in what-ifs, a monument to how fragile Formula One expansion projects can be.